Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am so excited to have my friend and colleague Maya Feller with me today, and we're going to be talking about her new book, Eating from Our Roots. So, hi, Maya. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks for having me. And hi to everybody else out there.
So, Maya is an incredible dietitian. She's a colleague. She's a well-known nutrition expert. You can see her on TV, such as Good Morning America. And she's published this amazing book that we're going to be talking about. But also, she's really focused on nutrition education that's from an anti-bias, patient-centered, culturally sensitive approach, which I think is amazing. So I wanted to welcome you and also ask if you could share a little bit more about your passion in the nutrition world, what you're excited about, and how this kind of led to writing this book.
So I feel like similar to you, we care so much about making sure that people actually have access to nourishing foods and foods that also taste great. When I was studying to become a dietitian, kind of the recommendations that were taught to us were really around restriction. And I even remember in some of my clinical rotations, there were these things that people would say, oh, the dietitians are the calorie cutters. They are the ones that come in and tell us, don't eat this and don't eat that. And I realized that when I actually left school, that was how I was trained. But then I interacted with people in the real world. And I realized that I had to kind of shift how I was thinking about nutrition. I had to put the patient, the person that I was working with, at the center of the conversation. I had to listen to them, step back and say, oh, interesting. Tell me more. What's going to work for you? How can I support this? How can I help you find a way that you can replicate this healthy behavior over and over again? Oh, you want to have more fruits and vegetables? Well, how do we find the fruits and vegetables that you like? Are they affordable? And so through my kind of clinical work with patients, I realized, well, everything that I'd learned, I had to relearn. And then I also realized that there's tons of nutrition confusion out there, right? And that I wanted to be part of, this movement of dietitians who's really encouraging people to think about what they can add to their plates and thinking about what they can add to their plates that actually support their health goals without shame, right? And also taking the whole person and their culture, their background, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, their literacy and health literacy into consideration. So that's how I got to, writing this book.
That's so great. And you're so right. In our nutrition education, we're often focused on, being the food police, what people can't eat instead of what they can eat. And a lot of the foods that they're eating are all already healthy and wholesome. But yet, sometimes people have shame around their food choices, which is my next question is how do you help connect people to these wholesome foods, that maybe they've lost connection with, or maybe they don't even understand how beautiful these foods are. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes when we hear like eating from our roots and we hear the word culture, we think like, oh, that's someone else, that's not me. But everybody has culture, right? We're all part of cultural groups that follow social norms that we agree upon. And so when you look at kind of these recommendations, you see half the plate is a non-starchy vegetable, a quarter is protein, and then a quarter is starch. Very few people actually sit down and eat in food compartments. We eat a lot of mixed foods. Like I was just thinking the other day of like waffles, for example. Well, what if we wanted to make a waffle savory? And like one of my friends who's from Ohio, like absolutely loves waffles. That's like a huge part of his cultural background. And I was like, well, what can we do with waffles? It's a great base and we can add all sorts of things to it. And we can also play with the base ingredients. And so you'll never hear me say like, don't eat a waffle. I'll just say, well, when do you want to eat the waffle? How can we modify the ingredients to make it really satiating, nourishing, tasty? And if you have a condition, something that supports your health goals. So let's say you have diabetes. Well, maybe we'll modify the flour so that we're adding a little bit more protein, reducing the starch, right? So that you can actually have that waffle, and then we'll top it with something to make it a wholesome, nourishing meal that also keeps your blood sugars more stable or relatively balanced, rather than the no, you can't have it. How do we modify it to fit your goals?
I love that. So it's just working with all the foods that people cherish and love. And the waffles is a great example. So, do you feel that a lot of us have lost our connection to our culture and our roots? Like my mom grew up in Arkansas, and that was such a huge part of my eating style. And she never really lost that. And I've really cherished that. But, in the food world, this is something we're so passionate about. But when in your work, are you seeing that this connection's kind of been lost a little bit?
Absolutely. So when we think about the US, right, it's this major melting pot.
Mhm.
And it's this melting pot of people who've come here from all over the world. And sometimes what happens is people come here and they actually let go of whatever their pattern of eating from where they're from. And they start to acculturate and take on things that following like what we refer to as the standard American diet, right? So
Yeah.
foods that are food, right? But we know that if they're the center of your pattern of eating, it can be problematic in terms of your health.
Mm.
Um, Burgers are fantastic, but burgers for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's a challenge. Salads are fantastic, but salads for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, also a challenge. And what I found with my patients who come from everywhere, and we could like take a little line and go all around the globe, up and down, all of them say because they didn't grow up eating that recommended plate method, they don't know how
Mhm.
to fit their food into it. And they're like, I
Yeah.
didn't grow up with, brown rice and a steamed vegetable and a grilled animal protein. Like I have patients who are from Southeast Asia and they follow mainly vegetarian pattern of eating. I
Mhm.
remember interviewing someone, actually one of the people who helped contribute to the book, and they said that when they, they came from an Indian family who ate mostly vegetarian, and they actually said that they felt some level of shame because they didn't eat meat,
Mhm.
right? Because they
Mhm.
followed a mainly vegetarian pattern of eating. And so it's interesting somehow, and sometimes we disconnect so that we can quote unquote fit in, and
Yeah.
use these things that are inherently, as you said, wholesome and really great for us.
Yeah, it's very sad. And I've seen this in the research that so many cultures, when they move to the US, they assimilate quite quickly to the diet. And then they lose all these health benefits that are associated with their traditional diets. And I also feel, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, that a lot of people don't even appreciate how healthful their diet pattern is. For example, we have so much, there's so much knowledge on the Mediterranean diet, which is a very healthy diet, which is a beautiful diet. But there are other traditional diets that are healthy that we may not have researched as well. So do you feel that sometimes people don't even realize how healthful their pattern of eating might really be?
Absolutely. And I think that that's a perfect example, right? So we
Mhm.
do talk about the Mediterranean diet because there's all of this research. However, there are 22 nations around the Mediterranean. And if you look at some of those countries, North Africa, parts of the Middle East, the patterns are quite similar. There's a lot of legumes, there's a lot of, heart healthy oils. You're seeing animal proteins in moderation, if at all. The additives are lots of herbs and spices. So we're talking phytonutrients, antioxidants. Wonderful. Sitting down to a plate of hummus and za'atar with pita bread. I mean, incredible. So like if there is dairy, there's fermented dairy. And we
Yeah.
don't think about that as being part of that Mediterranean pattern of eating when it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. Like I've had patients say like, oh, can I have a tortilla? And I'm like, absolutely. Corn tortillas, amazing. With beans in them, incredible. You know what I mean? And then vegetables and maybe a little bit of a hot sauce and a salsa, wonderful. And I see it even with patients of mine from the Caribbean and like Trinidad and Tobago, there are a lot of great curries that are there. And, they have
Mhm.
curry chickpeas, and then there's pumpkin and spinach. And all of that is inherently wholesome and really, really nourishing. But then it doesn't look like the steamed vegetable, the grilled animal protein, and the baked potato. So then they say, well, can I have it? And I'm like, you absolutely can, and you should.
Yes, that's so true. Like my mother, as I was mentioning, is from Arkansas, and a classic dish that she still loves to this day is black-eyed peas with greens and cornbread. And
Yum.
that was considered poor man's food. There was like some shame around eating that, but it's like the healthiest thing that she could be eating. And I think it's amazing. We have it all the time. So that's an example, I feel, of these beautiful foods that maybe we have undervalued, and it's a shame. But you mentioned the SAD diet, the standard American diet, which is kind of the way the average person eats in America. It's linked with all these health risks. It's also called the Western diet. So yet many of us have this beautiful cultural roots. So how do you work with people to get them to find those roots and bring them back into their diets?
Yeah, well, first I have to say that I love your image of that you just conjured up of that dish that your mom makes. And I also have to say that a big part of how I talk to people, and you said it so perfectly, Sharon, is like in nutrition and in the food space, there's a hierarchy. And things that we think of as like poor people food or basic gets pushed down to the bottom, and then there's shame around it, right?
Yeah.
So beans from scratch, oh, that's something that poor people eat. Cereal, ooh, no good, right? It gets pushed down. And so I actually talk to my patients about what are those simple foods that you may have grown up eating that are nostalgic for you, full of flavor, and can we bring those back? And you would not believe how many people, like even to the like last week, I was talking to a patient, encouraging them to actually go out and look for peaches in a jar because it's the middle of winter. And they said, well, I can't eat that. And I said, of course you can. If you want to put that on your yogurt or your cereal grain, that's a great way to get a peach. And they said they were going to wait until the summer because it wasn't in season. Because part of what we do in food is we tell people these huge statements that they take to heart and hold on to as like, this is the pinnacle of what I should do. And we miss the nuance. And then people are missing out on wonderfully nutritious food. So I do a lot of talking about what are those things that you love? How can we make sure that we get them to your plate in a way that A, supports your health, right? And is mindful, right? So I'm not saying we're going to go out there and we're going to throw sugar and salt on everything with abandon. What I'm saying is, how do we have those things show up? And then we use the additives intentionally so that you can actually say, oh, this is delicious. It's something I want to eat.
Yeah, I love that. When you were talking about the peaches, it reminded me as a dietitian, how sometimes we're responsible for these messages. We make these statements and then it can affect people. It can confuse people and they're just trying to make the best decisions they can make. So it's really a reminder for us in the nutrition world to try to consider all these factors and the influence we have. So that's a really great kind of reminder to us. And I also love what you said about, using these ingredients more mindfully. It's like, obviously the Western diet with its high sodium, high sugar, highly processed, foods versus whole foods has been linked with negative health outcomes. But, it's a mindful way of doing, like, for example, I like to, save my sugar for where it really counts as like a fruit cobbler or something like that, rather than have it in all of my food products throughout the day. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, like how to mindfully, so people can still enjoy their favorite foods, but also move away from the standard American diet.
Yeah, I think it's so complicated. And Sharon, I often say, like, the answer that I'm going to give is 100% from my lens. So like you're talking about a Northeast, dietitian who lives in a part of the country where we love, a particular type of food and we're very into the farmers market culture and, pork it's a bubble, right? So that's from my lens. And yes, I've traveled, and yes, I'm a Black woman. So then that's the other part of my lens that gets mixed in. And then I have the experiences with my patients. So like, I'm always aware that something that I say will resonate with some, but not with all. And
Mhm.
when I'm thinking about like mindfulness, the first thing that I say is, well, you have to have the emotional capital available to actually engage in mindfulness.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
know from working in communities where people have more than 2 jobs, sometimes the emotional capital needs to be actually focused elsewhere. And there's no problem with that whatsoever. And maybe the emotional capital is, how do I get a meal on the table that actually is nourishing and that everyone in my family will eat so that there's not plate waste, right? And
Mhm.
that, I think, has to be part of the conversation, because it is
Yeah.
a luxury to think, to muse. It's a
Yeah.
luxury. And so,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? So I often say that when we're thinking about mindfulness, it doesn't have to be all the time. And it can
Mhm.
be at times when when you have that emotional capital available to you.
Mhm.
I do think because we have this we've got an epidemic of chronic conditions in the US.
Yeah.
And we are a nation of people who are quite unwell, right? Between
Mhm.
diabetes, cardiovascular disease, disorders of lipid metabolism, there's plenty of space. And so usually what I say to people, and I know you'll love this, is where can you add more plants into your pattern of eating, right? And how can
Yeah.
you have that be a constant? Uh,
Mhm.
and that oftentimes with my patients, I'll prioritize 2 things in the mindfulness category. And one is rest and the other is plants,
Yeah.
right? So how can you take time to actually rest? Because when we're not well rested, everything's 10 times harder.
Yeah.
And then how can you add more plants? And those are like the big things that I talk about. And then I say
Mhm.
to my patients, you know, added sugars, added salts, synthetic and lab made fats. If you're able, pay attention. Say like, do
Yeah.
I want this? Do I want this in the form that it's being presented to me? And if I don't, what's the way that I
Mhm.
can modify it?
Mhm. Mhm. That's so well said. Yeah, I mean, we really do have to consider all the factors. It's so complicated, when it comes to what people have access to and the foods that are on tables. So I think that's very well said. And I love what you said about plants, of course. And as a plant-based dietitian, I'm passionate about trying to encourage people to eat more plant foods, no matter what that looks like to them. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that when you look at these cultural traditional diets, many of them were plant-based, like when you look at countries around the world, you see these common denominators where people mostly ate a plant-based diet. There was a pulse in the diet. There was a whole grain. There were lots of regional fruits and vegetables. So what are your thoughts about that aspect of traditional diets?
I love it. I mean, from like a Maya taste perspective, I absolutely love it. But also from like a nutrition and health perspective, there's an abundance of research around the benefits of plants. When we're thinking about helping to reduce systemic inflammation, when we're thinking about helping to keep blood sugars more stable, when we're thinking about like cardiovascular disease, plants show up time and time again. And it's funny, Sharon, I remember when I was in college, my husband, who was then my boyfriend, I went to Switzerland for a summer, like when we were dating, which was very fun. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. I hadn't been back since I was like a really little kid. And we went, and at lunch, they have these menus, and you can choose, like, you sit down, right? Everyone takes a lunch break. We're talking, silverware. We're talking about china plates, like not fancy at all, but everyone sits down and they take this lunch break, and you choose your menu. You can have menu A or B, and there's always a salad. There's always a vegetable. And Sharon, when I was there, I said, well, these are the best salads I've ever tasted. Do you know what they did? They seasoned their vegetables. The same way that when I would travel through the Caribbean, or if we went to visit parts of Africa, people were seasoning their vegetables. They seasoned every vegetable. The green beans were seasoned, the beet salad, the cucumber salad, everything had flavor. And I, as someone who was born in the Northeast, you can sit down at a restaurant and have a plate of mixed greens that just has a dressing on it. There's no herbs. We haven't done anything to it. And then we wonder, we're like, well, why didn't you eat your steamed vegetable? And so I agree with you when you're thinking about regional flavors and tastes. What is always in my mind with these plants is the fact that generally when you travel around the globe, people are using herbs, spices, fresh dried, you know what I mean, as a way to bring the flavor of the plants up.
I love that. And it's so true because, traditionally American food hasn't always been so great with seasoning the vegetables. And of course we've moved past that in a lot of our culinary styles, but we're kind of famous for like steamed or like boiled Brussels sprouts when they're so good, when they're roasted with cumin or something, that's a great point. Just making vegetables delicious goes a long way. And we're starting to see that with new culinary styles. People are actually loving vegetables now. So I love that. And this kind of brings me, your conversation kind of brings me to the question about global diets, because you are really interested in that too in your work. And one question I have is if you have thoughts, especially in the nutrition world, about approaching global food traditions in a culturally humble way. I love global food traditions as well, but do you have any suggestions or thoughts on that as well?
100%. So I always say for the individual, you want to start from whatever your pattern of eating is. So if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you're going to modify whatever the dishes are so that it's in line with your personal pattern of eating. If you have an allergy, you modify for the allergy. If that's not the case, I often say, do your best to try the food in its original form. Just give it a try, right? Without wanting to do anything to it. Just try it in its original form, no matter what it is, right? If you don't have any kind of patterns that you're following, or like there's a reason for the modification. Because I know in, US health and wellness, we like to healthify everything. There can be a dish that doesn't have a vegetable and we're like, it needs a vegetable. I'm going to add a vegetable to it. Yes, you can have a brownie and it doesn't need to be made with black beans and spinach inside. You can just have a brownie and enjoy it, And so I think that that's also a part of the cultural humility, is being willing to try the dishes just as they are. And then also, of course, if you want to modify it, do so, but to give it a try in its original way and to reframe how you're thinking about healthy. One of the chefs that contributed to the book said something so interesting to me. He's from the Philippines, and he said, there are animal proteins that they eat, but he pointed out that people may have this much of the animal protein, 2 inches, which is totally different than how we interact with, 16, 12 ounce gigantic piece of, steak, which is fine if that's what people want. But it's really different if you're sitting down to a small piece of meat, 1 or 2, right? And it's been made and maybe sweetened with a little pineapple juice, then every day sitting down to 12 or 16 ounces of, and there, there's research, right, Sharon? So it's like, I think that oftentimes I use this analogy. I say, people feel great when they go to a steakhouse and they have a martini and it's like really a wonderful experience, but then they'll look down on someone who's having McDonald's and a soda, right? And the truth is, from my perspective, when I'm thinking about it, nutrition and clinically and behaviors and patterns, there's a difference, but it's not a market difference.
Yeah, that's such a great analogy. I love that. I love that. And I also really like what you said about the chef and the Filipino food way, where you're just using a small portion of animal protein, which is very, similar in many cultures where, the animal protein is not the center of the plate. It's just, it's almost like a seasoning in this beautiful dish that includes lots of other plant foods. And I like to recommend that as a way to, people who are interested in more plant-based eating, start trying some of these dishes that, it's all about the plants with just a little bit of animal protein. So,
I agree. I
yeah.
agree. I mean, we can all stand to add many more plants to our pattern of eating.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to shift gears and talk more about your book, and explore what your book provides to people in terms of helping them understand more global dishes and global cuisine, and a little bit more about that. Fill
Yeah.
us in.
So the book is, I'd say, tastes of home as
Mhm.
you move around the globe for people. And then it'll be like reminiscent or musings of any trips that someone who's not from the place has taken.
Mhm.
Used heritage recipes as the base and then took culinary license. So, for example, there's a Trinidadian callaloo that was inspired by my grandmother's callaloo, but I used Chinese broccoli instead of something called a dasheen bush, which is a big taro leaf, or spinach, because I wanted a little bit of a different flavor. So we played with all the tastes so that it is like, that's familiar, right? And we were really careful to honor the flavors.
Mhm.
It was chef tested in my home kitchen. Sharon, I have 5 burners. So like really close to just like your average stove, stovetop. I don't have 12. It was not like a huge test kitchen. It was my home kitchen, my pots and pans, all of my, utensils. And the idea was that, yes, of course, as a dietitian who loves food, and cooks all the time, if we can do it in my kitchen, then that means that people can replicate those flavors and also the technique. And
Mhm.
our hope is that we can invite people back into the kitchen as a part of their regular, because I strongly believe that when we're cooking, that's when we can modify and play with things. That's when it's like, oh, I've got my base recipe for pancakes. Ooh, let me try all these different things and add these things in because I'm curious, right? And I want to know what that's going to be like,
Mhm.
because we've gotten so separate from the act of chopping and dicing and slicing. And we
Yeah.
are down to wanting a 5-minute meal. And sometimes that's totally warranted, but there's so much that we can gain from reacquainting ourselves with the act of spending time with food.
Mhm.
Doesn't have to be always, but like at least sometimes.
I love that. I'm a huge advocate of trying to find that time in the kitchen and reframing it, because it's gotten to be, socially, we kind of consider it to be a nuisance. Like you said, the 5-minute meals, and in some cultures, it's actually a reverent thing to cook, because that means you have ingredients. It's like such an honored thing to be able to nourish your family. And of course, we have our time constraints. So many people are struggling to take care of their families. So we have, of course, I acknowledge that, but there's this idea that cooking is just so, it's just such a terrible thing, but I find it relaxing. It's almost like meditation for me. But one thing I like to recommend, because I know people are busy, is that, even if you just have one day a week, we all know what our best day is. For me, it's Sunday. I love to cook on Sunday because I've been to the farmer's market, I've been to my shopping. And so then every Sunday I like to try a new recipe. And then it seems more, more doable. Than the other meals can be those quick, easy meals. But I love what you're saying, that we can, reacquaint ourselves with the kitchens again. So that's wonderful. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about, I just talked about how busy people are. What do you have any more tips for people who really want to do this? They want to cook more, and we know that people are watching food videos and recipe videos all the time. So there is this interest out there. But when it comes to the busy part of it, what are your tips?
I'm a huge use a chef's helper. So something that's already chopped, something that's already diced, something that's in a can, something that's frozen as a way to work around anything that's lengthy.
Mhm.
So let's say, you want to make one of the recipes in the book, and it's like, okay, we want you to like slice and dice all this stuff. Does your store have whatever those ingredients are already chopped? You know what I mean? So that it cuts down on the work. Absolutely lean into that. The other thing that I like as well is a combination of partially prepared foods with things that you're going to make at home. And I do this with my patients quite a bit. Let's say, you want to have green beans, and then you want to like roast a cauliflower. And roasting a cauliflower, it takes time. It does. You're talking 30 minutes in the oven. Well, does your local grocery store have either green beans that are frozen, or do they have green beans that are already seasoned and cooked and frozen? And can you purchase those? So that one thing is just like in the pan, and then the other thing is taking time. So I like a combination of those in the home.
Mhm.
And I remind people that salad from a bag is still salad.
Yeah.
If you want to buy the salad and wash it and chop it yourself, that's fantastic. But salad from a bag is the same, you know what I mean, as having the salad that you've washed and chopped. And so to remove any kind of shame around like, oh, I didn't make it all myself.
Yeah, absolutely. And frozen vegetables and canned vegetables, all these things that you were talking about, it's all whatever, whatever helps people. Those are still nutritious foods that count. So I also want to know what some of your favorite recipes and stories are in the book. Maybe you could share a little bit.
Yeah, so I would say that I don't have a favorite recipe in the book. I love them all, but my favorite section is the plant section and then the seafood section. And it's hard. Some days it's the seafood section first is my favorite, and then plant forward is sometimes my favorite, but it's because I really love seafood and I really love plants.
Mhm.
I often joke, people will say like, how can you eat dandelion greens? Well, I'm the person, Sharon, that will take like beet greens, dandelion greens, and a Vidalia onion and garlic, saute it, and I'm like, this is the best thing I've ever had. So, I think the plant section is absolutely wonderful. And then the seafood section is like very, very near and dear to my heart. So those two are my favorite. And in terms of like a story from the book, I think it was, so Chef Sylvia Barbon was the main chef who tested all the recipes in my kitchen with me. And we would have so I developed some recipes, she developed some recipes. We had 6 other chefs that submitted recipes, and then we would modify them, based on kind of whatever we had available. So some recipes would call for things that we just couldn't find. And so we'd say, okay, what's the next best thing? And it was really funny because I talked about the additives before. She was always saying, we need more salt. And I was like, absolutely not. No more salt. What can we put in that gives that, flavor? So there was a lot of learning that was happening in the kitchen and really trying to keep taste at the forefront, but modifying it so that, I was thinking about health and nutrition because I know the larger context of what people do eat.
Yeah. Yeah. Salt is a good one. That's a good example when you're working with culinary experts and, I do the same thing. I'm always like really minimal with my salt. Yeah, well, that's great. And I also wanted to mention to everyone that I am going to include a blog that goes along with this interview, and I'm going to have all this great information from Maya in her book. And I also want you to share any resources or any ways that we can connect with you if you have any of those right now too.
Thanks. Yeah. So your listeners can find me across social media, Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook at Maya Feller RD, or they can head over to my website, mayafellernutrition.com. And if they're interested in purchasing a copy of Eating from Our Roots or gifting it to someone that they love, they can get the book everywhere that books are sold.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Maya. This has been so fun, and we're going to post all this information on the blog, so go check it out. And we will see you next time. Thank you, Maya. Bye.
Sharon, thank you.